It is night. There is no flashlight, no candle, no glowing screen in your pocket. There is no fire either, not a single ember anywhere for miles, because the ability to control flame simply doesn't exist yet. The temperature is dropping fast, the way it does in open country once the sun disappears, and somewhere out in that darkness, something with teeth is moving. You have no walls. You have no weapon beyond a sharpened stick. You have skin, fingernails, and a body that, compared to almost every other predator on this landscape, is slow, weak, and embarrassingly soft. And yet, for well over 1,000,000 years, your ancestors lived exactly like this. Not for a single rough winter. For an almost incomprehensible stretch of time, generation after generation, through ice ages, through brutal cold snaps, through pitch-black nights crawling with predators, without ever once striking a flame on purpose. Controlled fire, the kind you can make whenever you want, reliably, is actually a shockingly recent human skill. For the overwhelming majority of our evolutionary story, our ancestors survived the cold, the dark, and the danger with nothing but their bodies, their behavior, and each other. That should sound impossible. Nearly every other cold-climate mammal on Earth comes pre-equipped with thick fur, blubber, or the ability to hibernate through the worst months. Humans have almost none of that. We are, by mammal standards, nearly naked, thin-skinned, and metabolically expensive. We shouldn't have made it through a single harsh winter without fire, let alone the hundreds of thousands of winters that came before we figured out how to make flame on command. But here's the part that gets stranger the deeper you look. The absence of fire didn't just fail to stop our ancestors. It appears to have actively shaped some of the most important traits that make us human in the first place, from the way our bodies are built to the way we sleep, eat, and even socialize. Losing this one tool forced an entirely different survival system to evolve, one built almost entirely out of behavior, biology, and cooperation instead of technology. Let's start with why this problem was even as severe as it sounds. Let's start with exactly how dangerous a fireless night actually is for a body like ours. Humans lose heat extraordinarily fast compared to most mammals our size. We lack a thick fur coat, we lack substantial insulating blubber except in very specific populations adapted to extreme cold, and our skin is riddled with sweat glands built for shedding heat, not trapping it. In an environment where nighttime temperatures drop close to freezing, a fireless, sheltered human can lose body heat quickly enough to develop hypothermia within a matter of hours, especially if wet, exhausted, or malnourished, all of which were common realities in the ancient world. Fire, once available, solved this instantly and dramatically. Without it, the body has almost no backup plan except behavior. And that's exactly where the story gets interesting, because ancient humans, and the even earlier hominins before them, built an entire toolkit of behavioral thermoregulation, ways of managing body heat through action rather than equipment. The first and most fundamental of these tools was simply staying close. Group huddling isn't just an emotional comfort behavior, it's a serious thermodynamic strategy. A single sleeping human loses heat from essentially their entire body's surface simultaneously. A group of humans sleeping pressed together in a tight cluster dramatically reduces the total exposed surface area per person, because each body is partially shielded by the bodies around it. Multiply that across 10 or 15 people curled together in a shallow cave or rock shelter, and the effective warmth generated is enormous compared to any one individual sleeping alone. This wasn't a lucky accident either. Evidence from numerous archaeological sites shows tightly clustered sleeping arrangements going back deep into our evolutionary past, and some researchers argue this collective sleeping behavior is one of the underlying reasons humans became such intensely social, emotionally bonded animals in the first place. When your survival quite literally depends on the warm bodies pressed against yours every single night, staying on good terms with your group stops being a nicety. It becomes existential. Shelter selection mattered just as much as the people inside it. Long before anyone was constructing buildings, ancient humans and their predecessors were remarkably strategic about where they chose to sleep. Natural rock overhangs, shallow caves, and dense thickets weren't chosen randomly. They were chosen because they blocked wind, retained a small amount of ambient warmth, and reduce the effective sky exposure that causes rapid nighttime heat loss through radiation. On a clear night with no cloud cover, an exposed body radiates heat directly upward into the open sky at a startling rate, which is part of why clear, cold nights feel so much colder than cloudy ones even at the same air temperature. A rock overhang interrupts that radiative loss almost completely, acting like a thermal ceiling. Choosing the right 10 square meters of terrain to sleep in, night after night, across a lifetime, across a species, across hundreds of thousands of years, was itself a survival technology, invisible, but every bit as real as a woven blanket. Let's talk about the body itself, because biology did a huge amount of the work that fire would eventually take over. Physical adaptation played a massive role long before behavioral solutions alone could carry the full weight of survival. Populations that lived in consistently cold environments for many generations developed measurably different body proportions compared to populations from warmer regions, a pattern well documented across human history and still visible in populations today. Shorter limbs and a more compact, rounder torso reduce the ratio of skin's surface area to body volume, which means less surface available for heat to escape relative to the amount of heat-generating mass inside. It's the same physics that makes a small, round object cool down more slowly than a long, thin one of equal volume. This isn't a conscious strategy, it's evolution quietly optimizing the geometry of the human body over countless generations in response to relentless cold pressure, and it happened specifically because fire alone wasn't reliably available to solve the problem for everyone, everywhere, at all times. Metabolism adjusted too. Populations with long histories in cold climates show evidence of subtly different metabolic rates and fat distribution patterns, generating and retaining slightly more internal heat as a baseline than populations whose ancestors spent that same evolutionary time in consistently warm regions. The body, in other words, was doing quiet chemistry to compensate for a missing external heat source, running its internal furnace a little hotter because there was no guaranteed campfire to lean on instead. Diet without fire tells an equally fascinating story, and it directly shaped the raw physical shape of our ancestors' skulls and guts. Cooking, when it eventually arrived, made food dramatically easier to digest, unlocking far more calories from the same amount of food with far less digestive effort. Before that innovation, hominins survived on raw meat, raw tubers, raw fibrous plants, insects, and marrow cracked directly out of bone with stone tools. This required a digestive system built completely differently from ours today, a longer gut, more powerful jaw muscles, and larger, more heavily enameled teeth capable of grinding tough raw material for extended periods every single day. Chewing wasn't a quick daily task, it was an hours-long, near-constant activity, because raw food yields its nutrition slowly and reluctantly. Some of the physical features that eventually shrank once cooking became widespread, including jaw size, tooth size, and gut length, were essentially load-bearing structures built specifically to solve a fireless nutrition problem. When fire finally entered the picture and cooking became routine, those same structures became unnecessary and, over evolutionary time, shrank, freeing up energy that the body redirected elsewhere, including, many researchers argue, toward fueling a rapidly growing and increasingly expensive brain. Let's talk about something that rarely gets mentioned in this story at all: the sheer psychological weight of total darkness, night after night, for an entire lifetime, with nothing to push it back. Fire does more than warm a body. It illuminates a small circle of visible, controllable space in the middle of an otherwise impenetrable black, and that circle of light appears to have mattered enormously to the human mind once it finally existed. Before it did, ancient hominins faced something modern humans almost never experience anymore: absolute, unbroken darkness for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours at a stretch, depending on the season and the latitude, with only moonlight and starlight, when available, to work with. There was no pushing that darkness back. There was no small warm circle of visibility to retreat into. There was only the group, pressed together, listening. This mattered behaviorally in ways that are easy to overlook. Without a fire to stare into, without flickering light to focus attention and mark the boundary between the safety of camp and the danger of the wider dark, groups appear to have relied even more heavily on close physical contact and on sound, low voices, breathing, the small reassuring noises of other bodies nearby, as a substitute anchor against the disorienting totality of nighttime blackness. Some researchers studying modern hunter-gatherer groups that still spend portions of the year without ready access to fire have noted that darkness without flame produces a distinctly different, more vigilant, more tightly clustered sleeping pattern than darkness with even a small fire present, suggesting this psychological dimension of fireless nights left its own mark on ancient social behavior. Layered directly on top of the purely thermal and defensive reasons for huddling together, moonlight became a genuinely important variable in this world in a way it simply isn't for us today. A bright full moon meant a night with real visibility, a night when movement, limited foraging, or repositioning to a better shelter might actually be possible without stumbling blind through unfamiliar terrain. A new moon, by contrast, meant true, disorienting blackness, a night when staying absolutely still, clustered, and quiet was often the only sensible option regardless of temperature or hunger. It's a reasonable guess, supported by patterns observed in many cultures with oral traditions stretching back into deep history, that lunar cycles shaped ancient behavioral rhythms far more directly and far more urgently than most people today would ever assume, precisely because moonlight was, for an enormous stretch of human history, the only backup lighting system available on a night with no fire at all. Predator avoidance without the deterrent effect of fire required an entirely different behavioral rulebook as well. Fire, once mastered, became an extraordinary predator deterrent almost overnight, because most large carnivores have an instinctive aversion to flame and smoke. Before that tool existed, ancient hominins had to rely on something else entirely: elevation, vigilance, and numbers. Many early hominins likely slept in trees, or on cliff faces and rock ledges accessible only through narrow, defensible routes, deliberately choosing locations that large ground predators couldn't easily reach or ambush. Group vigilance filled in the rest of the gap. Sleeping in a tight cluster doesn't just conserve heat, it also means more eyes, ears, and noses are collectively monitoring the darkness at any given moment, with at least some portion of the group in a lighter, more easily woken stage of sleep at almost any time throughout the night. This distributed alertness, spread unevenly across a resting group, functioned as a kind of living, breathing early warning system, something no single sleeping individual, no matter how cautious, could ever manage alone. Clothing, in its earliest and crudest form, also predates controlled fire use by an enormous stretch of time, and it developed as a direct, physical answer to exactly this problem. Long before woven textiles or tailored garments, hominins were already using raw animal hides, simply draped, wrapped, or tied around the body, as an improvised insulating layer. Genetic evidence from body lice, an organism that only thrives in clothing rather than directly on skin or in fur, suggests humans were wearing some form of body covering for an extraordinarily long stretch of our history, likely well before we had any reliable way to make fire on demand. That raw hide, stripped straight from a recently killed animal and wrapped around bare shoulders, was in a very real sense the very first heating system our species ever adopted, a borrowed layer of somebody else's fur standing in for the layer we ourselves never evolved. Timing mattered enormously as well. Without fire to extend usable hours into the night, ancient daily rhythms were built almost entirely around the sun. Activity was concentrated heavily during daylight, when temperatures were highest and visibility allowed groups to travel, forage, hunt, and gather with maximum safety and efficiency. As darkness approached, behavior shifted decisively toward shelter, stillness, and clustering, essentially powering down the group's exposure to both cold and predation risks simultaneously. This wasn't laziness or lack of ambition, it was an extremely efficient allocation of a genuinely dangerous resource, nighttime, that offered very little upside and an enormous amount of downside without the protective, warming, illuminating effect that fire would eventually provide. There's something worth sitting with here for a moment. We tend to imagine the invention of fire as the single dramatic turning point that finally allowed humans to survive harsh conditions, as though everything before it was simply desperate, doomed struggle. But the truth is almost the opposite. The strategies our ancestors developed without fire, huddling for shared warmth, careful shelter selection based on wind and radiative heat loss, physically adapted bodies suited to cold climates, raw diets supported by specialized digestive anatomy, elevated and defensible sleeping sites, distributed nighttime vigilance, and improvised clothing from animal hides, weren't a broken half-measure waiting to be replaced. They were a complete, functioning survival system in their own right, refined and tested across an almost unimaginable span of time, long before flame ever entered the picture. Fire didn't rescue a failing species. It arrived as an upgrade to a system that had already been quietly succeeding for a very, very long time. And when fire finally did arrive, first as opportunistically captured wildfire, tended and carried carefully rather than created from scratch, and only much later as something ancient humans could reliably produce themselves on demand, it didn't erase everything that came before it. It layered on top. Groups kept huddling together even once fire provided warmth, because the social bonds built through that closeness had become valuable for far more than temperature regulation alone. Shelter selection continued to matter even with fire available, because a good rock overhang still blocked wind and radiative heat loss that flame alone couldn't fully counter. Clothing continued to evolve and improve rather than disappear, because fire warms a fixed space, while clothing travels with the body wherever it goes. Fire didn't replace the fireless survival system our ancestors built. It joined it, becoming one more layer in an already deep, carefully assembled toolkit of cold weather survival that had been under continuous development for well over 1,000,000 years. Right now, you can adjust a thermostat, pull on a factory-made jacket, and never once think seriously about whether tonight's temperature might genuinely threaten your life. That level of safety is astonishingly recent, and it sits directly on top of a much older, much quieter foundation, one built not from flame, but from bodies pressed together in the dark, from caves chosen carefully for the way they block the wind, from raw hides wrapped around cold shoulders, and from countless watchful eyes taking turns through the night so that everyone else could sleep just a little more safely. Long before anyone learned to strike a spark, your ancestors had already figured out how to survive the cold using nothing but each other. And somehow, night after night, freezing winter after freezing winter, without a single flame to their name, that was enough.